السلام علیکم. امیدوارستم که در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. امروز بسیار یک میمان گرامی داریم در صدای حق تلویزیون. دکتر سوزی اسماعیل هسته و امروز امروی ما هسته در برنامه. Good afternoon. I wish that no matter where you are in the world that you are happy and healthy. This morning, we have Dr. Suzy Ismail on our program today. She is the founder of Cornerstone Family and Marriage Intervention. We will be discussing a very important topic that has really come up in the news and in media as of recently, which is suicide. Unfortunately, there was a very sad and tragic event that happened in Allen, Texas recently with community members. I think at times we seem to think that these things don't happen in our community. But as was highlighted recently, we have learned that this is not the case, that these types of things happen in all communities. So we're so incredibly excited to have Dr. Ismail with us today. I'll tell you a little bit about her. It doesn't really do justice to all of the amazing work she does, but just to give a little bit of a background, Dr. Suzy Ismail is the founding director of Cornerstone, which is a nonprofit faith-based communication intervention organization with several locations around the world that focus on youth, family, marriage, identity, socio-emotional wellness, and relationship rebuilding. She's also the author of many books, including Modern Muslim Marriage, 9 to 5, When Muslim Marriage Fails, and several other works. She specializes in educating and empowering women, youth, and vulnerable populations by presenting a range of workshops, lectures, programs, diversity seminars, and corporate trainings, both nationally and internationally. As a visiting professor for over a decade in the communication departments of Rutgers University and DeVry, Dr. Ismail has researched, written, and presented extensively on the intersectionality of education, faith, communication, and culture. She's also served for many years as a student advisor, teacher, and board member of a local private school. And Dr. Ismail has been interviewed on numerous media outlets and is often featured on talk shows, radio and television broadcasts, and podcasts regarding her amazing work. She's presented on the topics of marriage, family, parenting, identity, and teens at many public and private universities around the world, and at the World Meeting of Families during Pope Francis's first visit to the US. She's traveled to the border of Syria to work with refugee women, families, and orphans, and continues her work with resettlement and relief agencies providing integration intervention. For many years, Dr. Ismail has served as an executive officer and director on several non-for-profit boards, commissions, and organizations. Her humanitarian work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Ambassador for Peace Award and the Visionary Muslim Award. She holds a Master's of Art in Communication and a Master's of Philosophy in Human Services and a PhD in Human Services, focusing on family studies and intervention strategies. And of course, Dr. Ismail currently resides in Princeton, New Jersey, with her amazing husband and beautiful 3 children. Thank you so much, Dr. Ismail, for being here with us today on our show. We're so incredibly honored to have you. And before we get into some solid questions, I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about how you became interested in this field and kind of some of the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Freshna, for having me on the show, and for addressing a topic that I think is super important and that is incredibly timely, especially within this past year. With the pandemic, we've seen the effects and the impacts of depression, anxiety, panic disorders, and so many mental health issues that have affected people. So, my journey kind of into this field of, holistic wellness, and that's really the focus of the work that I do, not necessarily a mental health care niche, but looking at social, emotional, spiritual, and relational wellness in conjunction with mental health care. For years, I studied in the field of communication, and in studying in the field of communication, I spent a lot of time looking into relationships and what makes a relationship work and what makes a relationship not work. And some of my earlier books focused on marriage and divorce, and really just researching what happens between people, whether it's in the family paradigm as husband and wife, whether it's as parents and their children, whether it's, community members, individuals in the workplace. And the more that I kind of studied relationships, the more I realized just how complicated they are, and that it takes more than just good communication, which is kind of the core that initially I had approached the research in, but it takes more than just good communication to make a relationship work. And that individually at the intrapersonal level, internally, that's really where it begins. So I became much more interested in the inner workings of how individuals get to a healthy place internally so that they can have healthy relationships externally. And that's kind of how I started in the field.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that insight. And it's really interesting because I think you mentioned the pandemic and you mentioned that things have really escalated with regards to the way people are feeling, the way that people are interacting with each other. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how much have you noticed the level of depression increasing over the past year? Have you seen, is there a correlation between, for example, the refugee population and as opposed to the general population? I know that I receive many phone calls on a daily basis with regards to this. People who were not necessarily ever having issues before, either in their marriages or in their relationships, now they're developing all these types of problems with being at home all the time, being around each other, kind of the routine being switched up, and of course, everything else that came, all the living loss that came with the pandemic.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of times we use the term depression very lightly when it really does have layers, and depression itself, comes in different forms, So a lot of times in high schools, for example, or in colleges, we'll hear kids saying, oh, I'm so depressed, without necessarily differentiating between feeling, sad in the moment or feeling anxious, possibly, or feeling disgruntled, and not distinguishing between situational depression, chronic depression, clinical depression. So really, when we utilize the term depression, we shouldn't think of it as like a blanket term that covers anyone who's feeling a bit down, because there's a lot more to it than that. But within the pandemic, I would say incidences of what we would consider situational depression were definitely very rampant, in that in response to the situation, in response to the pandemic, a lot of people were struggling. And we're not just talking about grown adults, but we definitely were seeing it among children, teens, college students, seniors in high school who never got their senior year, individuals who were looking forward to something and it suddenly was almost like taken away from them. In addition to that, of course, the loss of life that so many people witnessed, the loss of jobs, the loss of wealth, the loss of health, and the fear that pervaded the uncertainty of not knowing what was going to happen next. So I would hesitate to simply use the term depression. We definitely saw a lot of mental health issues, a lot of socio-emotional issues. Yes, depression was one of them, but we really want to distinguish and kind of better understand that it's not necessarily a blanket term, that there are degrees of depression, and that we want to kind of change the dialogue of how we talk about depression, because there are so many levels to it.
Absolutely. And I think that within the respective cultures that we all emanate from, there is this taboo or there is this stigma that's attached. And this definitely makes it a more difficult hurdle to kind of overcome. So, how do you think that we can approach that? Like, for example, I know in the Afghan American community or Afghan diaspora, you know, to talk about mental health is something that is not prevalent. And if somebody is suffering, questions are asked like, well, what else do you want from your life? You know, you have everything. Your husband's good to you. You have a house, you have a car, you have a job. What else do you want? Right? These types of questions are brought up. And if people have different types of episodes or something happens, it's swept under the rug. And there's this common notion that if somebody is struggling with a mental health or a behavioral health issue, that they're quote unquote crazy, or they don't perceive it in the same way, for example, that we do like from a scientific lens. So how do we kind of approach that, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So I think that's definitely a great question. The stigma of mental health care and seeking mental health wellness, it's definitely prevalent among so many Muslim communities, so many Arab communities, so many communities from Southeast Asia, and as you were saying, so many communities from the Afghan diaspora as well. And so I think what we're seeing today, I think, alhamdulillah, we're starting to see a bit more openness, willingness to discuss, but we're not quite there yet in being able to encourage and see people seek help when they are struggling. Hand in hand with the idea of dismissing somebody's difficulties and thinking that their difficulties are not big enough to warrant them feeling depressed or feeling down or unsettled or unable to function. What goes hand in hand with that is this assumption also that your faith is not strong enough, that you need to strengthen your iman, that you're clearly not praying and this is why you're going through this, or it's because you're disconnected from Allah and that's the problem. And the reality is that those two elements, feeling depressed and having weak iman or lack of faith, are not necessarily like mutually exclusive. It's not that if you're depressed, then it's clearly a sign of weak faith. Depression is an illness, and again, we want to look at it as clinical depression or chronic depression. That is an illness, and it's something that needs to be treated. It's something that there are remedies for, but we have to seek out those remedies, and we can't seek out those remedies if we don't first identify the problem and admit that it is a problem. And depression can strike anyone at any time. And I think sometimes we feel like we're immune to any type of mental health disorder or mental health difficulty because we feel like we've got this fortitude that I can handle it. But that's not always the case, and we know that it's even in the Quran and the Islamic tradition, there are reminders that people will be tested, and how we respond to those tests, it may be different. We're meant to have patience, and again, this is something that a lot of people will talk about, like you're not patient enough, and that's why you're depressed. But patience again looks different for different people, and what may be patience for someone, as in trying to like sleep things off, or trying to remain at home and just getting up and getting dressed, that may be a form of trying, and for someone else it may be actually leaving the home, getting an appointment, seeking treatment, and that's the place that we want to get everyone to, that not being afraid to admit that there is a problem, understanding the signs and the symptoms when it is serious and you need to seek help, and then seeking that help, knowing the avenues and the resources of where you can get help.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight, especially when it comes to self-awareness. How can you deal with a problem or an issue if you're in denial about what you're facing or what you're going through? And I know in particular for the Afghan community and for lack of a better term, other brown communities, we often see that there is this sense of I'll be okay, I'll be fine, I don't need help. And then it gets to a point where you turn on the television and you see this disturbing news, and you see somebody who looks like you, who sounds like you, who believes in the same religion as you, and then, or is in the same age group as you, and then it's just baffling. I know that when I watched the news with this recent event that transpired, and there was a note that was left, and it was very, very chilling to the core, because a lot of what this individual mentioned in their note wasn't too many things out of the ordinary. It wasn't anything that didn't particularly make any sense. Sometimes people assume that, again, if somebody is suffering from a certain ailment, a mental health issue, that they're going to be quote unquote mental, and perhaps they're not going to be coherent and their words may not necessarily mesh. But there was this narrative, and there was a lot of different things that was mentioned in the narrative that was really important to understand and realize. For example, there was this sense of this one sentence that really stuck out at me was about how, yeah, everything seemed to be perfect. Yeah, I did have the job, I did have the schooling, but you don't know how it feels, right? And it's very concerning, and it's something that, again, it's very uncomfortable to talk about within the community, but it's something that we need to really address. So, Dr. Smail, I wanted to ask you, now that we're talking about suicide, really, what is the difference between somebody who has suicidal ideation and somebody who actually attempts suicide?
So, I think you bring up a really good point, and before answering the question of the difference between the two, I do want to kind of center a little bit on that, the manifesto that the teenager had written prior to taking his own life and the life of his family members. And I think along with that idea that externally things seemed like it was fine, the child had also written that his father had tried to get him help. He had seen a psychiatrist, he had taken medication, and none of it seemed to work. And he also talked about the purpose of life being happiness, and that if you couldn't find happiness, then what was the purpose of living? And I think those two elements are super important because this is part of the work that we do at Cornerstone is really taking like a multi-pronged approach to wellness, because we know that people can seek psychiatric care and psychological care, and sometimes it doesn't work, and people can seek faith avenues and seeking out connections, and alone that doesn't work either. So the approach of really finding the multiple pieces together. So if the child had found a greater purpose for life other than happiness from a faith perspective, because we know from a faith perspective that the purpose of life is not happiness, but seeking contentment in from the Islamic tradition and worshiping your Lord. And that seeking contentment or finding what Islamically is known as rida is the impetus to push us to continue to strive, to continue to keep going, essentially. And with that piece missing, despite going to the psychiatrist, seeking psychological care, taking medication, there was a missing piece in that what we consider, the holistic spiritual, socio-emotional wellness, in addition to the psychological approach. So I think it's important for us to be able to better understand that once someone gets to the point of, thinking about ending their life, there has to be a transition that takes you from depression to despair. And again, a lot of times we'll say, oh, he was depressed, so he ended his life, or he was depressed, and so he was self-harming. And, depression doesn't necessarily equate to violence against self or others. What will usually send someone down the path of feeling like they don't want to be alive anymore or actively seeking ways to end their life is despair. And again, if we look Islamically from the Quran, there's a verse in the Quran that says, "La taqnatu min rahmatillah," which means don't ever despair from the mercy of Allah. Because despair is what leads us to believing that our lives are not worth it anymore, that we just can't keep living, or we don't want to keep living. So when we talk about suicide ideation, it's the thought process or the thinking that I don't want to be here anymore. And it's usually those beginning stages of despair, to believe that you don't want to be here anymore, that the world would be better without you, or your world would be better if you weren't existing in this particular dunya, in this world. To get there in those early stages, that is the pathway towards despair. And depression can turn into despair if it's untreated, if we're not seeking outlets, again, from a faith perspective, a community perspective, a psychological, social, emotional, and relational perspective. So when you start to think about not wanting to exist anymore, this is already red flag behavior. I know we talk about identifying red flag behavior in terms of active suicide attempts, but realistically speaking, from the moment that someone says, I don't feel like being here, or I don't want to be here anymore, that needs to be an alert to the loved ones, an alert to friends, an alert to medical professionals, an alert to anyone that comes into contact with someone like that, because that's a call for help. Now, when we talk about moving into what's considered, I guess, from a psychological perspective, the actual red flags, this is when there are suicide attempts. If someone, might, and a lot of times with attempts, we'll see initial attempts not necessarily yielding the result that the person intended. And again, they might be calls for help. So, children who are cutting, for example, many times they are not thinking about actually ending their life. They're looking for a release, an outlet. The child out of Allen, Texas, the teenager, also had mentioned he'd been cutting for years, and that his cutting process had begun, once a week maybe. Then it started becoming once a day. Then it was several times a day. Then he would miss quizzes, in his calculus class he had mentioned because he was in the bathroom cutting. This is clearly a call for help, and that's, again, we're moving into red flag behavior. So even during the process of self-harm, if someone is not thinking, oh, I want to end my life right now, but they're looking for a form of relief, that self-harm can be, what may lead to the next step of, digging deeper and deeper and harming yourself further and further. And we usually see that with multiple attempts of, suicide, of trying to take one's life, eventually the attempts get stronger and stronger. And if proper treatment isn't sought, if there isn't a remedy and, an ability to reach this person, unfortunately, the attempts may end up in committing suicide.
Very difficult words to hear, difficult words to really comprehend, especially I feel personally as a mother. I often kind of try to get into the heads of my children. What are they thinking? What are they doing? And I wonder if you could share with us also some telltale signs, I guess, of, there are children who are, or adolescents or adults who are more open with their emotions, who kind of very openly display certain things. And from their personalities, you would be able to tell if something was wrong. But I find that there is also this population of folks who are not as open and are more quiet. And sometimes these things slip through the cracks because they may not be displaying or they may not be sharing with people how they're feeling, and are there behavioral patterns that we can look for, or some red flags, as you had mentioned, that we can really be weary of.
Yeah. So, I think this is a good question because all of us need to be educated and kind of seeking out avenues of recognition. And there are some great programs now known as like the mental health first aid programs where there's, I believe it's like a 6-hour program or something where you can kind of learn how to identify signs from, again, the psychological perspective. But a lot of the telltale signs tend to be socio-emotional as well. So someone who may have been, a little bit more outgoing and suddenly is withdrawn, not leaving their room, spending more time on the phone, on the laptop, not enjoying things they used to enjoy. Changes in appetite, either overeating or not eating at all. Both of those could be signifying something that's going on the psychological or emotional level. Someone who you start to see kind of telltale signs, if a child, for example, or a teenager is wearing long sleeves and it's, the middle of summer, and they're refusing to lift up the sleeves of their shirts, a lot of times that may be indicative of cutting or self-harm behaviors that are there. So, awareness is key, and if there's someone that is close to you, you will have a sense of what, I guess, normal behavior for that person is. And normal behavior for each person is different. But, the best weapon, essentially, in terms of awareness and knowing that something may be wrong is recognizing the baseline, knowing, what is the baseline of an individual? What do they normally look like? How do they normally act, on a regular basis? And what's changing, again, are you seeing appetite changes? Are you seeing mood swings, where there are outbursts maybe that are happening, or quietude, shutting down? Are you seeing a dip in grades for a child, for example? Are you seeing that withdrawal that we said, spending hours alone in the room with the door closed? So recognize the baseline, identify for your loved ones, your family members, your friends, know what they're like, and also identify for yourself, because we're talking a lot about recognizing in others. But sometimes it does start with us, for us to look internally and say, wait, how am I doing? Taking stock of our emotions. And so many times we don't do enough of that because we're so focused on caring for others. So it requires just a lot of questioning of what the baseline is and whether or not there's changes in the baseline.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Ismail, sometimes, especially in the past year, it's been a very difficult year for me personally with a lot of loss and, of course, for everybody. Uh, but I noticed that when I get to that point, that I feel really down or I feel really sad. And again, like you had mentioned, it's important to identify the feelings and it's important to make sure that you are not running to this word depression for feeling sad or feeling sorrow or feeling grief. My go to is always Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's always, um, for the most part, trying to seek within the deen, trying to do dhikr or remembrance of Allah, and trying to reconnect on a spiritual level. I feel, listening to Quran gives me this solace and gives me this inner peace. What are some other recommendations and what does Islam say specifically about grief and about feeling this hopelessness and in order to preserve your life and in order not to go down that road, uh, can you share with us some of the Islamic stance and perspective?
Yeah. So, one of the most beautiful verses in the Quran, I think that talks to difficulty and our response in a moment of difficulty, and that really humanizes our responses that are very deep and emotional sometimes, is a verse in the Quran where Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Isa, is going through the pains of labor, and she says, she calls out, she says, "Ya laytani mitt qabla hada wa kuntu nasyan mansiya." Oh, if only I had passed before this and had been of those who were forgotten. And we know Maryam is one of the chosen women who will enter Jannah, inshallah. And yet here there's a very human moment that the Quran is kind of teaching us that, even in this difficulty, in this hardship, someone whose faith is so strong, who was confident and conscious all of her life that Allah would say, kun fayakun, be and it would be. And yet here in her moment of difficulty, she thinks, if only I wasn't here, if only I had passed away, because she's experiencing such hardship. And I think what's so beautiful is that the verse that follows that in the Quran is a verse in which a voice calls to her, nudiya min tahtiha, that from beneath her, a voice calls to her and says, La tahzani, do not be sad. And her attention is called to a stream that runs beside her. And she's commanded to do something, right? In the next verse, she's commanded to shake the trunk of the palm tree. Not because, she has a burst of energy and she can shake the trunk of the palm tree and the dates are going to fall, but because she's being commanded to do something that there is an acknowledgement that she is in a very difficult space. There's an acknowledgement and understanding, not a rebuke, not a message of like, you can't say that. It's a recognition that this is hard and this is a test and it's not easy. And it's hard to be here. It's hard to be in this dunya when we're being tested in such difficult ways. But she's commanded to kind of keep going, to do something. And she's also commanded in the following verse to not say anything, to not speak when she goes back to her people. And I think that's so important for us because so many times when someone is going through hardship or difficulty, experiencing really deep, profound pain, we kind of tell them, talk to me, tell me what's going on. How can I help you if you're not going to talk to me? And yet, not just with Maryam alayhi salam, but we see it in so many of the other situations as well. When prophets are given difficult tests, they are commanded by Allah not to not speak for 3 days, to not speak to the people, and it's kind of a reminder that sometimes, we're not going to be able to speak when we're in moments of difficulty, and we just need someone to be beside us. We need someone to kind of just be there for us. And I think we forget that sometimes, this pandemic, I think one of the most difficult aspects of it was the lack of social contact, the inability to hug one another, the inability to be in our masajid, to find our safe spaces and interact with our community. And that sense of the social distancing that went hand in hand with, for many people, emotional distancing, has also been really difficult, because we know that we need people, and we need people because it is people sometimes that can help us through our most difficult times. And I think that's been part of the difficulty we've encountered.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And I think another thing that people give us is hope. And just this, and part of, like you had mentioned earlier, this very um, this note that was so profound and was so incredibly eye-opening, at least to me, that when you lose hope, that's kind of when things start to go down in a very dangerous path. And it is the hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always asks us, do not give up hope. Come to me, ask me, and I will give you what it is. Sometimes it's not as easy. And I'm a very big extroverted person. So I know that for me, it's very easy to just open up and just say everything and then I'm done, right? But it's important also to understand that not everybody's like that, especially when you're going through an extremely traumatic time. It is better to hold back. Also, I noticed that when you're pushed to kind of not hold back during that time, sometimes you may be in a state where you don't realize, you may be so angry or upset. You may say something to hurt somebody. I know that it's happened in the past, and it's such a wise verse because there's so much entailed there, and just holding back what it is that you're feeling, so in order not to hurt somebody, not to harm somebody else in your moment of pain. So when we hurt, we don't want to go ahead and recycle that and hurt somebody else, and instead perhaps seek that time to reflect, to think through our emotions, to really accept what it is that's going on, and then inshallah be able to open up and talk about what it is, because we go through such a different line of emotion in those moments: anger, denial, frustration, sorrow, and then eventually we can open up. So, thank you so much for giving us this beautiful. I feel already comforted by your words and the ayahs and the verses, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up the doors of our masajid in a way that we had gone before, so that we can also seek the solace in the house of Allah, which is really probably the number one go-to place that I feel the most at ease. But so, Dr. Ismail, how can we take preventative measures? What are some ways that we can prevent, um, even before we get to that point, these types of things from happening, or maybe if we can't help how it's happening, at least for the emotional, for emotional health and wellness?
Yeah. So, throughout this pandemic, and slightly before as well, we've been hearing a lot about mindfulness and, being mindful. And we see a lot of apps, whether it's like Calm or Headspace, that talk about mindfulness. From the Islamic perspective, mindfulness is actually ingrained in our deen, in our faith, and it's a part of our faith. And it's known as muraqabah. So muraqabah and hudur are two elements that kind of go hand in hand to build up that sense of mindfulness. Muraqabah is watchfulness, watching our actions, watching our intentions, watching our emotions, being in tune with what we're feeling. And hudur is presence. So being present in the moment and recognizing what we're feeling in the moment and giving space for that emotion to be expressed. There's a beautiful narration of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he was burying his son Ibrahim, his infant son, and it was a very difficult moment, and he was crying. And so the Sahaba who surrounded him, one of them asked him, are you بتعترض على قدر Allah? Are you going against the qadar of Allah? Why are you expressing this sadness? And the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam responded and said, العين تدمع, the eyes shed tears, and the heart feels sadness, or the heart grieves, but the tongue does not utter a word that goes against the hikmah of Allah. And so in that moment, we see that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was expressing his sorrow, was recognizing that this is a sad situation. This is muraqabah, watchfulness, knowing what you're feeling, identifying that feeling, and recognizing that it's okay to express that sadness. And we have so many examples, whether it's the father of Yusuf alayhi salam, when he cried upon the loss of his son, or believing that his son had passed away to the point where he lost his eyesight. We see it in the case of Prophet Yunus, when he cried in the belly of the whale, recognizing what he had done and what the role that he played in the process. And so we see it in so many situations, and sometimes we don't allow ourselves the space to grieve or to identify that emotion. So first off, having that muraqabah, that watchfulness, knowing our intentions, our emotions, and the output of those emotions, giving ourselves space to feel. And then hudur, being present, recognizing where we happen to be in our life at the moment. So when Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us, Inna ma'al usri yusra, surely verily with every hardship there comes ease, recognizing that the ease will come, that we may be in a moment of hardship here and now, but it will come, the ease. And I think it goes hand in hand with some practical exercises we can do as well, not waiting to be overwhelmed, but taking steps before that. So certain grounding techniques. There's a technique that we use quite frequently at Cornerstone known as the 5-4-3-2-1 method. And it actually ties very well with our Islamic concepts. The idea is to interrupt the negative thought train of the mind, so that if you're feeling like you're in a dark place, recentering yourself, that aspect of hudur, becoming present in the moment again by utilizing the five senses. So when you're feeling a sense of anxiety, a sense of deep sadness, a sense of grieving over loss, taking a moment to identify five things that you can see. And it may be a verse from the Quran that you have saved on your phone. It may be an ayah, or the 99 names of Allah that you might have as a tapestry in your room. But five things that you visually see. And we know, of course, in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jalla tells us, "Ala bi dhikrillah tatma'innul qulub," that surely it is but by the remembrance of Allah that hearts find ease. So as you're using that sense of sight, trying to guide your sight to things that do remind you of Allah, it kind of assists in that psychological and that spiritual connection that we talk about. Then it's going to be four things that you touch. And we know, Islamically, when we do tasbih, we know how important it is. Many of us will use, the tasbih beads, but there is also a narration of making tasbih on your fingers, on the uqla of the fingers, on each of the parts of the fingers. And so if you're pushing down, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, you're actually activating, and there's been some research recently on the activation of being able to push on these parts of the fingers, and they respond almost like acupuncture to activating other parts of the body. So again, it's part of our faith, and yet it's a treatment essentially for so many of the difficulties we encounter, but we don't realize it often. So four things that you can touch, and really identifying that sense of touch. Then it's going to be three things that you can smell. Maybe you have a oud from the last Umrah trip that you took, a misk that reminds you of something that brings you back to a positive place, a candle, a bukhur, but a scent that brings you back to a positive place. Then it's going to be two things you hear. Again, maybe you've got a verse from the Quran saved on your phone that you can hit play, and maybe it will bring you back to a positive place. And then the last one is one thing you can taste. And for some people, it is putting a date on their tongue because of a prophetic food that brings them back to their purpose and their understanding of why they're here. And for a lot of our teens, we actually recommend warhead candies or Sour Patch Kids, because it's something that's strong, that kind of activates the sense. And in doing these five steps, 5-4-3-2-1, in doing these five steps, a lot of times we can just calm ourselves down and bring ourselves back to a better place. And if praying 2 rak'ahs is something that also brings that calm, we're activating our sense of touch in that way. We're activating our recitation. So finding what works for you and being preventative about implementing those elements.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those techniques. I'll be sure to be using them as well when I feel these emotions. Also, Dr. Ismail, Cornerstone does some amazing work for the community with regards to preventative measures through workshops. And, I think it's very underrated the types of community services that you have out there Would you be able to tell us a little bit about some of these emotional wellness workshops that you do in your organization?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we do work with various communities, communities who speak different languages, communities from different cultural backgrounds, communities of different ages, different statuses in terms of background and where they're coming from. So, for example, in our refugee division, we work with several resettlement agencies to provide wellness workshops, parenting workshops, workshops on emotional wellness, on psychological wellness. We provide them in Dari, we provide them in Arabic, we provide them in Urdu, and we have just added a Tigrinya and Tamil workshop. So we'll be rolling those out as well. And we really try to focus on reaching people from a place that they're at, a place of comfort that works for them. And in all of these workshops, we incorporate the important faith-based elements as well. We do youth workshops for teens, we do parenting workshops for adults. We do emotional wellness workshops for geriatric care. So we work with a lot of the adult daycare programs in many different areas to provide spiritual wellness, emotional wellness programs for those who are elderly as well. And the workshop component goes hand in hand with introducing those who might be struggling and don't know where to go for help to the fact that after the workshop they can reach out to us at Cornerstone, and they can have intervention sessions with, alhamdulillah, we have several interventionists who do incredible work and who are really like the lifeblood of Cornerstone. But they can reach out to one of our interventionists and we'll partner that with someone who speaks their language, with someone who is a good fit for them for their needs. And they'll be able to have one-on-one sessions to work through their emotional difficulties.
Thank you so much for all of the work that you do with your organization. And it's really important for the viewers to know and understand. And we'll be putting the website at the bottom of the screen in the comment section, along with the phone number if there's any questions. But it's really important to know that there are community initiatives out there. There are places where you can go to at the start of these feelings, or maybe even not at the start, maybe at the point where you do feel hopeless, and you never know who may be the person that can change your heart, that can change your mind when it comes to some of these issues. Not everybody is going to be somebody who's suffering from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Not all behavioral health issues are necessarily going to go under these more extreme types of disorders in which you would need a psychiatrist or you would need medication. Some things in life very easily and very beautifully can be solved in this setting, right? As long as there's somebody there for you to provide you that support and to provide you that guidance, then you can, inshallah, biznillah, get through what you're going through, whether it's with your child, whether it is with your spouse. So please do take advantage of these services. Also, when it comes to the refugee population, a personal, very, for me personally, very dear to me, a population, as I am a child of a refugee. My mother is a political refugee, and I feel very passionate about this population and about the help that they need, especially when it comes to all of the different issues and culture shock and assimilation. And then on top of everything else, a pandemic and life in the United States. So if there is somebody out there that that is of, especially for the Afghan population, you're going to see more the SIV population, special immigrant visa holders that are going through this, know that these services are out there. And we thank you and we thank your organization for providing us with this very unique. It's not easy to find, if you go and you do your research, a faith based organization. Yes, there's Catholic Charities, which is a great model. But when we talk, we're talking Islamically, it's very difficult to find um, a place where you can go to and openly and freely and incorporate all of the teachings that we have in Islam into our conversations. So please do look at the website at the bottom of your screen and make sure you take a look and see if there's any services that you can provide to yourself or others that may need this. So Dr. Ismail, do you have any closing thoughts or advice for our audience today?
So first of all, thank you so much, Freshta, for having me on your show and for talking about this important topic and bringing it to light. I think, as we enter into Ramadan, as we kind of wrap up a very difficult year and a half now, or a year and a few months now, as people are getting vaccinated, we're starting to see that light, maybe that sense of hope that things may get better. But that doesn't mean that all the losses that so many of us have suffered, over the year are just going to disappear. And sometimes with trauma, we don't necessarily feel the impacts of the emotional trauma until we've passed through it. So if you are feeling like you are in a dark place, if you are feeling like you're struggling, there's no shame in admitting that you're in a dark place. There's no shame in, being vulnerable and opening up. Find someone that you trust. If you're not ready yet to make that phone call to a mental health professional, a therapist, a counselor, an interventionist, again, there's so many different avenues of help. If you're not ready to seek that professional help, open up to someone that you trust, open up to a family member. Maybe they can help guide you to where you need to be. But also be conscious and recognize and understand that not everyone is going to get it. Not everyone is going to know what you're going through or know how to respond. And that kind of takes us back to what we started the program with when we were saying that sometimes mental health issues, sometimes issues of depression, of emotional difficulty are dismissed. But you know you better than anyone else knows you. And if you are in that dark place, don't ignore it. Don't just think, it's fine. I just have to, get over it. Inshallah, you will get through it, but sometimes you do need that help to get through it. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Ismail, for all of your wise words. Thank you so much for giving us this amazing insight on suicide and depression, and when to know when somebody is in trouble and how to seek the help. These are very important things that I know that our community really needs to understand and perhaps don't know where to go or who to ask. There is a number at the bottom of your screen, and there is an area for your comments. If you have comments for Dr. Ismail or any questions, you can call the number and we'll make sure that she receives them. This part I am going to do in Dari. تشکر یک جهان سپاس از دکتر اسماعیل که امروز وقت خود داده و در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. اگه کامنت دارین در زیر اسکرینتان نمرسته میتونین که زنگ بزنین یا نوشته کنین کامنت های خود. بازم در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. Again, thank you so much. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for all the amazing work that you do in your in this dunya, in your deen, and in your akhirah. And that may you have a blessed Ramadan with your wonderful family. And thank you again for everything. And we hope to see you again on our show. Jazakumullah khair. And thank you. Assalamu alaikum.